Greetings, my name is Jonathan Sarna. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center of Israel Studies here at Brandeis, and it is really a great pleasure to welcome everyone, those joining us on Zoom, those here in the room where it happens, to this very special event that we have been awaiting with great anticipation here at the Schusterman Center. One of the most important things that we do is really create new knowledge. We have scholars who study subjects that have not previously been studied in any serious way, and who bring the fruits of their learning, their research into books, which are then shared with others. We have a particularly exciting book that we are launching today. Professor Ilana Szobel's new book entitled Flesh of My Flesh, Sexual Violence in Modern Hebrew Literature. And it's really wonderful that we have two wonderful scholars to help us understand better what Professor Szobel has accomplished in this book. And my hope, of course, is that after this program is done, all of you will rush and buy the book, which really breaks new ground in the study of Hebrew literature. Professor Ilana Szobel, in addition to being the author of this new book, is Associate Professor of Modern Hebrew Literature on the Joseph H. and Bell R. Braun Chair in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies. She's also part of the core faculty of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies here at Brandeis. She's published an important work on the poet Dalia Ravikovich, a book called A Poetics of Trauma, and she's now working on a new book, which we are all very excited about here at the Schusterman Center, called The Unchosen Body, Disability Culture in Israel. Today, we see the fruits of a book that she worked on for many years, Flesh of My Flesh, Sexual Violence in Modern Hebrew Literature. Joining us to discuss this volume is Professor Sue Lanser. Many of you know Sue, who is Professor Emerita of Comparative Literature, English, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Brandeis. She was important for many years here at the university, headed Women WGS program, headed the Division of the Humanities, and she's published extensively in areas of sexuality. Her most recent book, The Sexuality of History, Modernity, and the Sapphic, received the American Historical Society's prestigious John Kelly Prize. We also have with us our good friend and my Nedges colleague, Professor ChaeRan, who is the Francis and Max Elkon Chair of Modern Jewish History, and in addition to being in the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department, is now chair of the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Her work, which is very extensive, has focused on Jewish women, gender, and family. Her most recent book is entitled A Woman of Distinction, the life and diaries of Zinaida Polyakova, and really a remarkable volume that provides a glimpse into the world of Jewish financial elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg before the Russian Revolution. I'm really now happy to turn it over to Professor Fries. I do want to mention that we love to hear from you. I can see that many of you have already discovered the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Any questions, please feel free to send them in the chat feature. I will also say that we have enabled live captioning. That too is available at the bottom of your screen. Thank you for joining us, and I now turn it over to Professor Fries.
Thank you, Jonathan. And congratulations, Ilana, on your new book, which is a path-breaking and original study that explores sexual violence in Hebrew literature for the first time in a comprehensive and systematic way. Rather than treat sexual violence as an extraordinary catastrophic event or an exceptional breach in the social order, Ilana, I'll refer to you as Ilana, understands gender-based violence as a typical function of heteropatriarchy. She is especially interested in insidious trauma, which she defines as, quote, the daily incidents of marginalization, objectification, discrimination, and intimidation, which are repetitive and cumulative. What makes her book truly extraordinary is her excavation of non-canonical forgotten voices and narratives that she moves from the periphery to the center. I knew that I had entered a deep mine of precious treasures when I read about Rivka Alper's handwritten story, Mistake, the first female narrative in Hebrew literature of rape that had languished in the archives until now. Or the poignant works of Tzvia Lutievsky and Shoshana Shababo, just to name a few, who wrote about rape, incest, and sexual abuse in Israel from the margins of society. So in the few minutes that I have, I want to discuss Ilana's rich chapter on Tzvia Lutievsky, which especially resonated with me and gave me new insight into my own work on gender-based violence experienced by Jewish women in Tsarist Russia. So Ilana has established herself as the foremost scholar of Tzvia Lutievsky, a child of Holocaust survivors and a brilliant poet who was practically unknown in the US until now. Ilana recently co-edited and published a volume of the author's work, Core of Stillness, with Carmel Publishing House. And maybe, Jenny, you can put a link in the chat for that book. Ilana tells her readers that she will not address Lutievsky's experiences of parental abuse and incest, quote, in a simple sense. Well, we would never expect that of Ilana. But that she will center their reincarnation in poetry. And she writes, the poetic acts by nature and at its best, builds worlds that transcend the boundaries of the real world. It sets itself up not as a mirror to reflect what actually happened, but as a space to set down and verbalize complex emotional processes and responses that are not necessarily those that might be expected. And this is where I, a historian, envy the talents of literary scholars like Ilana, whose close readings of poetic texts opens up new understandings of that complex relationship between creative writing and personal experience. She astutely observes that Lutievsky's poetry, which is replete with mythological figures and imagery, provides us with clues about how to read her work. For example, the title of the cycle, Dionysius, Chapters of a Biography, which begins with a traumatic birth, she suggests could be a guide to reading Lutievsky's own biography. What follows in this amazing chapter, and I read it several times, is her persuasive identification and analysis of what she calls Litevsky's most sophisticated psychophonetic tools, the metamorphosis, for writing about sexual abuse and trauma. Based on her intimate knowledge of Litevsky's poetic works, Ilana suggests that her poems, like Acteon, might be read in the context of sexual trauma. For non-Hebrew readers, her book provides gorgeous, beautiful, gorgeous translations of Litevsky's work for the first time. And so I would like to begin by having you read in Hebrew the poem, and then I'll say a few words about your analysis.
So I'm reading Tzvi Litevsky's Acteon. עיניך לכודות בלובן יריחיים, קו מותן לך. שד זרוע מורמת, לעד נעלם מבטן ביער בית השחי. שיער ניחר קורץ במרפקיך, עורפך, גבך, בעצם הזנב. אוזניך נזקפות לצלילים העיליים שמעבר לשמיעת אדם, נפתחים כקשתות קתדרלה. אורך עונה ברטט עז, לחרקים שהתאהבו בך לפתע. עיניך חש בנשיכות הכלבים.
So Ilana's close readings have become her trademark. And in this case, her reading of this poem yields surprising insights that plumbs the depth of Litevsky's poetic persona. The poet, she declares, identifies not with the purported victim of this poem, and she begins with Diana, but with the process of Acteon's metamorphosis and detachment from his body. She writes, Acteon becomes a figure that embodies the psychosomatic response to a difficult experience, end of quote, and his body assumes what she calls the quality of woundedness, of being torn asunder. Referring to other Greek myths in which female rape victims are turned into animals, trees, or streams, Ilana notes that the metamorphosis not only silences women, but represents their inability to name their trauma, to verbalize their pain. And here we're quoting from Bell Hooks about naming that pain. In the case of Litevsky, she suggests that the psychopoetic mechanism of detachment or dissociation in the poem signals an important traumatic experience. An important theme in her book is the catastrophic crumbling of personal boundaries and bodily integrity when a victim experiences sexual violence. And this is especially the case for children. And she writes that childhood incest survivors live in chaos. All the boundaries of their world have been breached, bodily borders, mental borders, family frameworks. And it is a form of insidious trauma since it is not a single event, but intrusions without limits. Ilana observes, quote, in Litevsky's poetry, the father's assault takes place within the domestic familial realm. The home, Litevsky reminds us, is the representation of the soul with its burden of significance, territory, borders, protection, intimacy. It is the unhomely, unheimlich place. The inability or unwillingness of Litevsky's mother to protect the child because of her own emotional dysfunction and trauma is a source of her daughter's feelings of abandonment. And here, Ilana mines two poignant passages on the Holocaust trauma of Litevsky's mother that simultaneously orphans her child from her mother's emotional care, but also ties her by through an umbilical cord of yearning. To quote part of one of the poems that really struck me, at 5, quote, you swore never again to say mommy, Ima, after tearing your lips on the frozen iron railing. From the other side of your orphanhood, I come knocking. A word searches for a mouth, mommy, Ima. And this image of a poet knocking on the door of her mother's absence really just resonated with me. And Ilana quotes the feminist poet, Adrienne Rich, who wrote about this kind of traumatic desertion. quote, if a mother had deserted us, whatever our rational forgiveness, whatever the individual mother's love and strength, the child in us still feels at moments wildly unmothered, end of quote. So this brilliant and haunting analysis that Ilana provides of Lutevsky's work reminded me of a Russian court case that I found in Zhytomyr when I was writing my dissertation back in the 1990s. The case was not about incest, but about the rape of a young Jewish girl who worked as a domestic servant. So this past week, I went back to the case because Ilana's analysis made me think about sexual violence, insidious trauma, the breach of boundaries and trust in a domestic setting, and the problem of naming the pain, especially this about an unspeakable event before a Russian court and a Russian judge. So I'll share a little bit about this case to illustrate how Ilana's close readings inspired me as a historian to relook at this case through new eyes. So this case began in May of 1876, when 14-year-old Shendlia Zilberman, an orphan from Radzivilov, filed a suit against her employer in the criminal court of Volhynia. She testified that she worked as a domestic servant in the house of Moshe Serlik in the town of Dubno. On the day of her rape, all the family members had left to visit relatives for the Jewish holiday of Lag BaOmer, leaving her alone with the master of the house, Serlik. Since she lived under his roof, Zilberman understood Serlik's position in the household as a father, even if he was not her own parent. And we have to remember she's an orphan, and this is where your work really struck a chord. She recalled the violent events of that day, quote, Serlik slept and then he woke up. He called me to him and ordered me to give him water. I brought him the water. At first, he wanted me to sit next to him, but I did not consent. Then he threw me on the bed, covered my mouth with his hand and raped me. At the time of the struggle, I tore at his heart, bit his chest so that there could be a mark on his chest. Her refusal to sit on the bed made me wonder, second time reading this case, had she experienced those daily incidents of inappropriate contact that were repetitive and cumulative? In her testimony, not only did Zilberman stress her attempt to resist the rape, she described the pain of her defloration in detail. She writes, she speaks to the court, it hurt me very much. Мне было очень больно. I saw blood for 2 or 3 days in the genital area. He, Serlik, wiped the blood that was in the genital area with his shirt, but some of my blood remained, which I've shown you. To add insult to injury, she reported that Serlik was wearing his tzitzit during the rape, which she tore at during the struggle, an item that the court investigator found at his house. Zilberman presented the blood evidence to the investigator and informed him that she immediately reported the rape to 3 Jewish women, including a 16-year-old girl, Chaya Gershova, who confirmed the narrative and added that the victim had fled the employer's house the day after the rape. In a separate testimony, Zilberman revised the date of the assault to 8 days ago rather than 4, claiming that her error stemmed from her inability to speak Russian. And again, reading Ilana's work, I wondered, could she have mixed up the days because of her trauma, because of her confused sense of time? Of course, Moshe Serlik was a townsperson of Dubno, was married with children, young children, about her age, denied the charges vehemently. The unequal power relations could not be starker. In contrast to Zilberman, he was fluent in Russian, which meant he was not only able to communicate with the court investigator, but he came across as a more credible witness. His language was forceful. Quote, I categorically state that when I lay down to sleep, my wife, children, and servant, Shendlia, were in the house. He admitted he took a nap on the Jewish holiday between 1 and 4 in the afternoon, but in contrast to her narrative, he claimed that his family had returned when he woke up and there was no possibility of rape. He claimed that Shendlia invented this whole story about me, quote, because my wife wanted to fire her. He conjured up an image of an irresponsible young servant girl who had made up fanciful stories and stressed his own exemplary behavior as a husband and father. To prove that she was an innocent victim, Zilberman had to submit to an intrusive and humiliating court-mandated gynecological exam by a state doctor, a process that deterred some victims from reporting this kind of crime. Portrayed by the accused as lewd or deluded young women, the victims had to demonstrate that they were honorable and chaste, a near impossible task when the hymen, which determined a woman's sexual and moral mores, was not there after the rape. As Alexandra Oberlander puts it in her study on shame and sexual assault, a woman's body, and especially the state of her hymen, could contradict the same woman's statement and thus diminish her subjective evaluation. This evaluation undermined her respectability, which some may have considered too high a price to pay for some elusive justice. So in this case, the medical examiner concluded that there was no signs of violence or proof of rape, discrediting Zilberman's narrative of pain. But we have to remember that this examination took place a month after the event. Notably, Sirleck's wife and two women that Zilberman reported, the crime to did not provide testimonies, suggesting that the investigator did not even spend any time on this case and dismissed the case for lack of evidence. The worst part of this case was that she could have qualified for the rape of a minor, but the examiner said from her appearance, she looks 15 years old rather than 14. As a mother who's had a teenage daughter, I cannot tell you the difference between a 14 and a 15-year-old, but this changed the statutory rape, the possibility of statutory rape, which would not be considered. But at the same time, Sirleck exploited her minority to stress her childish lies to avoid getting fired. They all, of course, disregarded Zilberman's claims that she had not been paid her wages for 4 months. So the reality for rape victims was very complicated. Most, because the law viewed rape or iznasilovania as violence to satisfy the sexual impulses of a man or just as a person who is not married. The sexual impulses, and somebody who exploits the helpless, innervated victim against her will. I'll just briefly summarize that a study that was done between 1889 and 1893 of 33 provinces showed that that most cases, 92.4 out of 100 cases, were terminated even before they made it to court. It's very surprising to me that this case made it to court. That most people, the men who were brought to court were acquitted. In this case, about 70.6% were acquitted. What always surprised me was to find these rape cases filed by poor young claimants in Russian courts. But looking at the names, there were clearly people who were literate in Russian who helped them write the petition and pay for court expenses. Sometimes it was a state rabbi, other times it was a neighbor. Sometimes, as I was reading Ilana's book, maybe it was someone who heard their own experiences in these complaints, in Zilberman's plight. Although her rape was not incest, as in Litevsky's case, I could imagine Zilberman running through the labyrinth of that home that was not home to escape the Minotaur, which is the title of her poem, to flee this violence and the man who stole her girlhood. Zilberman was already orphaned when she came to work for Sirleck's family. Now she was without a home, knocking on the door of a Russian court to address her plight. And like many domestic servants whose voices were silenced by their employers in the court, she disappears from the court record. And I also, based on other cases that I've read, I think about the fact that these men felt entitled to the bodies of these domestic servants. They knew that these cases would never come to anything. So I wonder, as I was reading this case, if she, Silberman, might have metamorphosized into sort of like Sitsi to remind him that gam ani, me too. But I think that is too optimistic. So thank you, Ilana, for teaching me so much and for helping me reread a case that I've studied several times and have written about, but now hope to write an article about in a different way. Thank you so much.
Gender-based violence is an ongoing catastrophe that lives in our society in deep and troubling ways. I take these words from Anita Hill's new book, Believing, but they apply equally to Ilana Szobel's Flesh of My Flesh. Both of these brilliant new books by my esteemed and beloved colleagues in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies complicate and challenge feminist narratives of progress by exploring the reasons why sexual violence continues and by exposing the intersectional forms that it takes. When I taught my first introductory course in women's studies at the University of Wisconsin in 1975, I never imagined that I'd be saying so dire a message 4 decades from then. In that hopeful moment, women had begun to write and speak out, hotlines and crisis centers were being created, and legislation was changing the very definition of sexual assault. Yet today, the World Health Organization reports that at least 30% of all women over 15 have been subjected to sexual violence. In the United States, it is estimated that 81% of women and 43% of men experience assault or harassment in their lifetime. Gender-based violence against people of color, queer people, and trans people is markedly higher, and women and men with disabilities face rates of abuse twice those of the non-disabled. The short and shocking answer then is that sexual violence has not significantly abated over this half century. And the numbers only begin to mark the magnitude of the structural challenges that countries must address. For as we have learned to our peril, sexual violence is not a social aberration. In Ilana's own words, it conforms to and even authorizes patriarchal norms. Within this framework of global catastrophe, Flesh of My Flesh, Sexual Violence in Modern Hebrew Literature offers brave and brilliant interventions into both literature and politics, continuing the bold interpretive practices of Ilana's groundbreaking book, A Poetics of Trauma, the first ever and widely praised monograph on the poetry of Dalia Rabikovich. Now Ilana has extended her Poetics of Trauma to engage an entire century of Hebrew literature. As one sign of the book's far-reaching importance, Flesh of My Flesh was reviewed by the Jewish feminist magazine Lilith almost the minute the book appeared, a sign of urgency and public relevance almost unknown to us scholars of literature. Nor do I know of a book about the broad spectrum of sexual violence in any modern national literature that comes close to Flesh of My Flesh in its range, its analytical depth, and its intellectual courage. For as Chanel Dubovsky writes in her review of Lilith, Flesh of My Flesh is a work that prickles, that disturbs what we already know or believe we know. Ilana proclaims and then shows us that Hebrew literature is saturated with descriptions of sexual violence. She goes on to reread the work of such literary giants as Chaim Bialik and Yoram Kaniuk, exposing not only disturbing misprisions in their texts, but disturbing interpretations of their texts. Sometimes the very fact of sexual impropriety is written out of both the text and its reception. I'm struck by the example of Shalom Babayev's 1968 novel, The Seventh Glory, HaZohar HaShvi'i, in which the connection between a blinded and traumatized soldier and the sighted, able-bodied nurse on whom he is wholly dependent is presented as a, quote, beautiful relationship, even though, as Ilana writes, the text clearly shows that this relationship is fashioned on a foundation of abuse, a foundational abuse of hierarchical power. But Flesh of My Flesh not only rereads the canon of Hebrew literature, and ChaeRan has already presented this, it rewrites the canon, bringing to light an astonishing archive of forgotten, excluded, and sometimes unpublished works by women that offer alternative, against the grain representations. In so doing, Flesh of My Flesh creates a new literary history, opens new pathways of intellectual inquiry, and encourages still other voices to break the silence. In my view, the best gifts that scholarship can offer. One of the powerful examples Ilana offers is Henya Peckelman's memoir, The Life of a Woman Worker in the Homeland, Chaye Po'elet Ba'aretz, self-published in 1935. Unable to speak directly of her experience of rape, the narrator gives it powerful visibility by inserting lines filled with dashes between the words, I fell to the floor, and I do not remember anything more. And I am guessing that one of the greatest contributions that Flesh of My Flesh will be recognized as making to Hebrew literature lies in its extensive study of the writings of Shoshana Shababel, a prolific author born in 1910, whose novels and stories were disowned for decades by the literary establishment, and for whom, to quote Ilana, sexual violence is the prism for looking at the Sephardi community. From my own prism as a narratologist, I'm struck in reading these representations that Ilana analyzes so carefully by the abjectness of characters who are othered by the texts in which they appear, or who are unable to speak their own suffering, or whose trauma is dismissed as merely personal. I'm also struck by the efforts of so many of the texts to locate that trauma in a past that is over and done. It's a bitter irony affirmed by trauma theorists that the effects of violation not only continue into the present, but are often not even recognized until long after that violation occurs. The impact of the traumatic event lies precisely in its belatedness. Yet as Flesh of My Flesh argues, Hebrew literature emphasizes the necessity to get over and thus inevitably to conceal the ongoing effects of the violation. Which leads me to an even more expansive and urgent way in which Ilana's rereading of a century of novels, memoirs, stories, and poems disturbs. Beyond asking what Hebrew literature tells us about sexual violence, Flesh of My Flesh asks what that sexual violence tells us about Israeli society itself. In so doing, the book exposes the ways in which the forging of Israel's national identity is entangled with structures of dominance, uncovering a narrative of state preservation that produces and arguably even relies on sexual violence while denying not only the consequences, but even the fact of it. A powerful case in point is Amalia Kahana Karmon's 1966 story, Beersheva Birat HaNegev, Beersheva, capital of the Negev, a sexual encounter in which Noah, a Palmach soldier, blatantly coerces the young signal operator Ilana, has been read by at least 3 literary critics as a story of devoted love. As importantly, Flesh of My Flesh goes on to show that Noah's conquest of Ilana and the army's conquest of the Negev are set up textually as simultaneous, indeed as one and the same. Needless to say, the entanglement of sexual violence with geopolitics is not unique to Israeli society. But like Tolstoy's proverbial unhappy families, every culture of violence seems to underwrite, represent, and justify that violence in its own ways and by means of its own mythologies. Its uprooting thus requires the kind of analytical specificities that Flesh of My Flesh provides. Ilana exposes, quote, an unspoken connection between Zionist ideology and violence against women that highlights the sexual aggressiveness inherent in Israeliness itself. An aggressiveness, these are my words now, perhaps epitomized in the image of the strong, able-bodied, impervious Ashkenazi hero, and marked by an obsession, as Chanel Dubovsky puts it, to erase any past that paints Jews as weak or fragile. As in the United States, though in somewhat different configurations, Both sexual violence and its representability are also intersectional. Hebrew literature, Ilana tells us, is pretty much silent about violence against men and boys, against Palestinians and minority communities, against queer people, people with disabilities, and migrant workers, all of which amounts to what she calls a collective mental block. The upshot, as she puts it, is that Hebrew literature simply cannot cope with helplessness or hopelessness. In her powerful and visionary conclusion to Flesh of My Flesh, Ilana makes a crucial observation that Hebrew literature today actually lags behind other cultural spheres in confronting sexual violence. I've been thinking a lot about this and hoping we can talk about it. It's powerful insight. The emergence of awareness in such arenas as psychology, law, and cinema, she notes, has no parallel in Hebrew literature. If so, then literature also has a special place in helping us to confront the somberest sides of a culture so as to expose and change them. In this sense, literature becomes a repository, not of what is outdated, but of what is still repressed and resisted. A few years ago, I had the honor to attend a gathering with the former Israeli Supreme Court President, the Honorable Aharon Barak, for a discussion of differences between American and Israeli law. While US jurisprudence emphasizes the rights of the individual, what guides Israeli law is the collective. Indeed, as Barak puts it, the values of the State of Israel. Writing in 2009, Barak acknowledged the complexity of determining those values and balancing them with the principle of human dignity, which is also enshrined in Israeli law. Interestingly, he argues that determining those values requires the contributions of, quote, philosophers and researchers, rabbis and professors, yeshiva students and university students, and philosophers and researchers from around the world. Flesh of My Flesh effectively accepts this invitation by showing that some individuals may be more deeply subordinated to and more deeply harmed by those collective values. We might then further speculate that the primacy given to a partial or skewed notion of the collective has encouraged the sidelining of the literary voices that expose gender violence. As I think about these challenges from my own place in the universe and in the struggle against systemic sexual violence, I draw on language that my rabbi, Tova Spitzer, offered in her Rosh Hashanah Devar, her teaching this year. She asked us to recognize the fact of Jewish power and Jewish responsibility, along with Jewish suffering, and proposed a new mitzvah, a new commandment, which she named as Ahavat Yoshvei Haaretz, love for all those who dwell in the land of Israel, Palestine. In light of Ilana Szobel's urgent book, I speculate that Ahavat Yoshvei Haaretz would open a space where all human suffering is recognized as suffering, where trauma is not stuffed away beneath a facade of strength, where national and individual violations are understood as interconnected, where power itself is reconfigured so that those who have been silenced will be heard and the need to end the cycle of violence will be heeded. Flesh of My Flesh has made a profound contribution to this aim. I hope that not only scholars, but writers, artists, and activists will take its message, not simply as a powerful new reading of Hebrew literature, though that would be a great accomplishment, but as an inspiring call to change. As each of us considers how we can join the struggle to end the world catastrophe of gender violence, I conclude by evoking the words of the late Audre Lorde, self-described Black lesbian mother warrior poet, who famously reminds us that poetry is not a luxury and that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. When Lorde was diagnosed with breast cancer, she wrote a moving essay in which she reported asking herself, "Of what was I ever afraid? I will die whether I am silent or whether I speak." Then she turned that recognition into the poem, A Litany for Survival, from which I read in closing. For those of us who live at the shoreline standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk. For by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy-footed hope to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. When we speak, we are afraid. Our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Ilana, thank you for speaking. Congratulations. Kol hakavod.
Thank you so much, ChaeRan. Thank you all for coming. Oh, sorry, I need my PowerPoint. This one?
Down.
You can use that one.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming virtually and in person. I want to thank both Professor Ezra Capo, editor of SUNY Series in Contemporary Jewish Literature and Culture, and James Peltz, Associate Director and Editor-in-Chief at SUNY Press, for offering their knowledge and expertise and for being so wonderful to work with. I want to also thank the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies for hosting my book lunch. Professor Jonathan Sarna, Dr. Shana Wise, Risa Singer, Karen Goldblatt, Ann Simpson, and Wendy Schwartz. I'm so deeply grateful to you all for your kindness and enthusiasm. I'm also very grateful to the Department of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies, the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality, the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, and the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University for co-sponsoring the event. Finally, I would like to extend a special thank you to Professors Sue Lanser and ChaeRan Fries, not only for today, but for years of support and encouragement. Sue, thank you for starting and ending each discussion with a poem. And ChaeRan, thank you for being a role model and an ongoing source of inspiration. The book Flesh of My Flesh started when I was in high school. No, sorry, it's probably more accurate to say that it started when I was in college. Or maybe it actually launched when I became a mom. Or perhaps, in truth, it came into existence much earlier. Every time people ask me about the motivation for this book, I move between so many starting points that could be the activating impetus for this project. So many intersections in my life and in the lives of people I do not know are relevant for this book. This is not because there is something extraordinary about my life, but quite the opposite. This is precisely because this book is not about one traumatic event, one moment that could have changed the whole chain of everything in my life. Rather, it describes a routine. It describes an entire culture that allows for sexual violence to happen. In this sense, it's a claustrophobic book. It is a book that does not allow the insidious preventiveness of trauma to escape. And yet, over and over, people ask me why I wrote this book. They invite me to tell my story, invite themselves to peek into a story I did not invite them to hear. And despite my stubborn refusal to engage this dynamic in which activists and scholars of sexual violence are expected to reveal their own stories, within my silence, there is still one text that emerges and claims ownership over the question of why I wrote this story. It's not a story or a poem. It's not part of Hebrew culture, and it's not even a modern text, but it's a visual moment that captures not only the motivation to write this book, but also its core argument. The text is Goya's painting, You Will Not Escape, which, just like its name, does not allow me to break away from it. No te escaparás, you will not escape, is the caption that appears on plate 72 of Francisco Goya's masterpiece, Los Caprichos, first published in 1799. At the center of the image, we see a woman dancing and three monsters above and behind her. Her airy dance, her whispery dance, and widespread arms implies a sense of freedom and independence, although the three creatures in the background seem to close in on her. There is an obvious contrast between the three ugly masculine beasts and the delicate woman. And yet there is also an arresting similarity in the body language and positioning of the monsters and the dancer. This duality raises some unsolved questions. Do the monsters encourage the women's dance or threaten it? Is she dancing with them or in spite of their presence? Does the woman dance in defiance of her imprisonment, or does she actually celebrate it? And no less significant, are the monsters external to the woman or a reflection of her inner world? Do they represent some affliction from the past, present, or future? Are the monsters imaginary or concrete? Goya's plate exposes the complexity of a traumatized subjectivity while referring both to its gendered aspect and to its insidious nature. I grew up with the notion that rape is something that happens outside the typical range of human experience, that sexual violence is an extreme case, something that happens outside the norm. But Goya's painting, which I had with me in every place that I lived, sometimes on my desk and sometimes hidden among my books, insist on a different reality. And it was those figures in Goya's painting that slowly and patiently, some would say too slowly, showed me how to reread Hebrew literature, not as literature that depicts sexual violence as an extraordinary one-time experience, but rather as literature that locates specific traumatic events in the larger context of societal oppression, as literature that emphasizes the social context of sexual trauma and highlights the importance of examining the overlap between individual and cultural oppression, and by so doing, exposes the social norms and mechanisms that enable and at times encourage sexual violence. With that in mind, I show in the book how representations of sexual violence in Hebrew literature serve a variety of social interests, at times incompatible with actual victims' experiences or interests. While survivors' stories are central to the discussion of sexual violence, they are not the main narratives that appear in Hebrew literature. In fact, in Hebrew literature, the introduction of sexual violence into poetic and narrative settings is more often than not a literary device, meant not only to move the plot forward in particular ways, but more importantly, to cultivate ideological positions related to Zionism, gender, ethnicity, and disability in Israeli society. My book thus presents the various roles that tropes of sexual violence perform, some of which destabilize hegemonic notions, while others reinforce norms or mode of conduct. Accordingly, and you can see in the slide, the book's table of content, accordingly, through discussions about Hebrew representations of prostitution, as well as examinations of sexual relations between wounded soldiers and their caregivers, the book shows how sexual violence is used as a rhetorical tool to construct Jewish and Israeli heterosexual masculinity. By attending to Hebrew Sephardi literature, it explores the relationship between sexual violence and the establishment of Mizrahi femininity. While reading memoirs of incest survivors, the book examines the therapeutic effects of writing and shows the survivors' interest in social dialogue. And while reading contemporary poetry, it explores the poetic processing of sexual trauma. The chapter as a whole then embodies the intersectionality that the book examines. Thus, what I show in the book is that Hebrew literature not only provides a platform for the articulation of sexual violence, but since its representations of sexual aggression take into account the cultural, social, and poetic matrix of trauma, the writing and reading of sexual violence in Hebrew literature also becomes a political act by exposing the social roots of gender-based violence. In other words, while the book looks at poetic and social possibilities of action in relation to sexual violence, it also exposes the Gordian knot of gender-based violence and the intersect of heteronormativity, nationalism, racism, and ableism. Such critical analysis of both canonical and lesser-known texts uncovers the complex power dynamics, ideologies, and anxieties entwined in the construction of Hebrew cultural imagination. Approaching the end of my remarks here, I want to jump not to the closing, but rather to the beginning, and to give you a taste of the way in which a supposedly personal experience of rape is transformed into a political call for women's self-ownership. The unpublished and undated story Mistake, Shgaga, that ChaeRan mentioned earlier, written by Rivka Alper, probably in the early 1930s, may be the first story in Hebrew literature that addresses rape from the perspective of the raped woman. Rivka Alper was born in 1902 in Russia, and she immigrated to Palestine in 1926. With extraordinary sensitivity, the story tells the tale of Dinah, a young pioneer from Emerita who was raped by a young Jewish Zionist man. The story not only describes the rape itself and the mechanism of dissociation she experienced during the assault, but also chronicles the aftermath, her sense of guilt and shame, her social exclusion, and her inability to process or overcome her traumatic experience. Alper's story addresses rape as a personal experience while simultaneously locating it within the wider context of the Zionist movement, without attempting to disrupt or undermine it. At the same time, Mistake reveals the hidden violent aspects of the Zionist project, which aspired to establish a safe home for the Jewish people, but failed to provide emotional or physical safety to its female, and at times also male members. The story depicts the rape as a difficult and unexpected experience that does not actually deviate from the sexual harassment and violence to which Dinah and her female pioneer companions are exposed on a regular basis. To use Orion Zakai's words, the boundaries of the victimized body are not protected as hoped by the constitution of a distinct national identity. Rather, sexual violence is transported to the national setting and becomes part and parcel of the making of Zionist masculinity, end of quote. Perhaps this is why the story ends with what we might understand as a call for a fundamental change in the Jewish Zionist world. The story ends, and I quote, with a desire to have a corner, your own private bed. In the 1917 Balfour Declaration, the Zionist request was for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And Virginia Woolf, in her writings in 1929, calls for a room of one's own. Rivka Alper, in the 1930s, seemed to balance these demands by speaking of the desperate desire for your own private bed. The story does not end, as I mentioned, with the abandonment of the Zionist dream or with Dinah's departure from the Kibbutzah. Rather, it ends with a call for women to possess their own ownership of their bodies and lives. It is a call to protect the female body. It is a desperate plea, deeply aware of its own powerlessness, to create a private and safe space for women. In a way, this short story is an embodied articulation of that plea. It not only carries a feminist manifesto, but becomes in itself a corner, a literary space to preserve, process, and communicate the traumatic experience. Tzvi Litevsky, whom we read her poetry earlier, Tzvi Litevsky writes in one of her poems, pain is not emotion, pain is a place. which helps to describe the creation of the literary space that manifests as a result of shared pain and violence. It is in this space, the location of the poetics of the embodied effects of sexual violence, that stands at the heart of my book. Therefore, Flesh of My Flesh explores the poetic possibilities of writing within a patriarchal framework, of dancing with and against Goya's creatures, if you wish, looking not only at the political dimensions of writing itself, but also at the way in which the poetics of writing relates to, transmits, and process sexual violence. Thank you.
So I will open it up to questions. I will take questions from the chat and from the room. Unfortunately, my eyesight is so bad I can't see the chat. Jonathan, can you see it better?
So if you can take any questions from the room,
ChaeRan
from the chat.
is here to help you, and
Well, let's start with questions from the room and then I'll go to the chat. Continue to sending them in.
Questions from the room?
we'll take questions from the room if anybody here has questions. Yes.
Thank you so much, all. Go ahead. Thank you so much, everybody, for this eye-opening and enlightening conversation here today. Ilana, congratulations. Heartfelt congratulations. So Ilana, I'm not very familiar with the Israeli context and I haven't read the book yet, but I wanted to ask really a question about this back and forth between the collective and the individual, right? And especially for those who are displaced or colonized, right? There often is this bargain almost about when one can speak as the collective and when the individual can be addressed. So in the larger aims of the community, oftentimes the individual or the gender or the gendered or the unchosen, are left behind. And I'm just wondering if that's something you can speak to in the context of your work about the ways in which the formation of the nation or the community sometimes leaves behind gender or leaves behind the voice of the individual, in especially thinking about gender violence.
Yeah, thanks, Charlene, for this question. It's actually, it's an amazing question because of the supposedly inner contradiction between voices of survivors about sexual violence that are striving for their voices to be heard on an individual basis, and between a more Zionist maybe voice that, as you mentioned, put the collective first. But it's even more complex, I think, because what we see, or at least the theories about sexual violence that I work with that comes from feminist voices are calling not to focus on the individual experience, but rather to read individual experiences of sexual violence as part of, as we all mentioned here, systemic violence. So there is this tension between when do we focus on the individual and when do we focus on a more collective way. And I think that what I'm trying to show in this book is not just that the question is when do we focus in what, but rather that we can't really separate these two notions. I mean, we can't really continue talking in terms of individual experience and collective experience as if these are two entities that maintain some kind of tension. But rather what I'm trying to show is exactly how very individual acts of violence are represented in a way that serves the collective, and how collective experiences of violence are a result of targeting certain populations. So if there is something that I hope that the book is doing is leaving behind this illusion that we had, it was very productive. I mean, when you mentioned the 70s when the first rape classes were established in the States and also in Israel, and it was the area that taught us that the political is the private is public, and so it was a very productive and important stage in the feminist thought to have a conversation about private spheres and public spheres and the way that they work together, etc. But I hope that the book takes this notion ahead. Thanks for.
Thank you. It reminds me, your last point reminds me of the discussion in contemporary culture as rape as a plot device. and the discussions around shows like Game of Thrones and some of the others, and how do we portray this without reifying other sort of patriarchal ideas. So we have a question from Michal Dakel, and she said she admits that she has not read the book yet, but wanted to ask if you talk about Bialik's in the City of Slaughter, Be'ir HaHariga, especially with the discussion of rape victims. And I just want to say, for those of you who may not know, and one of the famous images, and this may be what Michal is thinking of, it's what I thought of, there is a Kohen, a priest, whose wife has been raped, and he asks the rabbi if he can still be married to his wife, because a Kohen whose wife has slept with another man, even if it was through rape, is now forbidden to his husband. And this is used as a critique of the passivity or the excessive piety of the Jewish people. So yeah, I was wondering if you speak about that, and if not, sort of what do you make sense of Bialik's use of this metaphor?
Yeah, thank you, Michal, for this question. We had the pleasure of having Professor Michal Decker here at Schusterman a few months ago. And also Professor Michal Decker herself wrote a lot about.
Oh, and I also just want to add that she's also talking about the testimonies of the actual rape victims in the Kishinev pogrom.
Yes, of course. And indeed, I am addressing Bialik in the book. And I'm showing, I was interested in Bialik not just because of the obvious relationship between what he wrote about rape victims and the actual testimonies that he collected in Kishinev and in the area, but mainly because I was interested not so much in Bialik, but that became in a way the urtext for a conversation about power in general in the Jewish world and the Zionist movement in general, but rather I was much more interested in what we do not see and what we do not usually hear because we're so focusing on Bialik. And that's why I looked into other writers that had some kind of inner dialogues with Bialik's writing, like Schofman, like Vogel, and I show how they actually wrote in a very different way about prostitution, and I'm showing how the focus on sexual violence in this area, that those writers basically had a dialogue that went through women's bodies in a way, and each one of them used those representations in different ways in order to talk about, of course, how surprising, about masculinity and not about women in prostitution or anything like that. But it's an interesting generation, and I'm talking about the tension between about why they chose to focus so much on sexual violence, and especially in the image of the prostitute, and I'm explaining it among many other things in this dual position that as men they could identify with their power position in regards to the prostitute, but as Jews who live as a minority at the time, in a much weaker position, they could identify with her lower status and her victimhood. So I'm showing how they're negotiating those options when they're thinking about their own masculinity in the early stages of the Zionist movement. We all know where Bialik took it, but I'm showing the book about, I'm also looking at the roads that were not taken.
Thank you. We have a question about audience. Right? Who do you imagine as a sort of ideal reader, other than all the amazing people sitting around here? And who do you see your, sort of work in dialogue with? And then, of course, Slava added an important question: are there plans to translate this work into Hebrew?
Yeah. Well, whenever I'm working with my daughters on her Hebrew reading and writing, I tell her that she needs to know Hebrew in order to read the poetry that I'm writing about. It doesn't work, it doesn't convince her at all. But in real life, the audience first, are my colleagues and students, but also I think that a lot of women that I'm in contact with in Israel, activists, survivors, victims, I have intense dialogue with them about those issues, and I hope that they will be able to read it. I mean, it's not by chance that I'm opening the book with a quote by Marva Zohar, who is an activist, a survivor, and a poet. So I think that my audience, my imaginary audience, are people that are interested in the topics and that will actually be able to make some kind of social change in a more active way than probably I would ever do.
We have a question. Oh, sorry. Is there a question from the room?
What?
What about the Hebrew translation?
I don't know. It's a big question. I had the same question with my first book, but maybe it is true that this book, I should actually do it. Yes.
Yes,
Thank you.
we're pro. We're pro. I wanted to ask about religious motifs and Jewish motifs, right? ChaeRan, you brought up the image of the seat, the sort of horrific image, especially because seat, right? These ritual fringes are Talmudically supposed to protect against sexual impropriety, right? Ilana, the title that you chose, right, is a biblical reference. And I was wondering if these images or motifs, whether they're biblical or sort of more Jewish generally, show up in your work and how they function.
Oh, that's a huge question. I think it has a lot to do with my training when I studied, when I did my master's, and also in the early stages of my PhD. You couldn't really do Hebrew literature without Bible studies. It was an option, of course, technically, but the assumption was that in order to understand modern Hebrew literature, you have to be familiar with Bible studies, with Jewish thought, with Talmud and things like that. So it's hard for me to separate, and throughout the book.
To be a major
motion. It's such a natural way to read modern Hebrew literature through Jewish references. So I don't know if I have anything specific to say about it in terms of.
Do certain motifs pop up more than others, like do Lot's daughters, for example, or this idea of Genesis, right? Like, you know, or right, what does one show up more so than the others?
And not necessarily. When I started this project, I thought that actually I had some biblical images that I thought it will come out as motifs, but they didn't. And actually, I think that what I'm showing in this book, for example, with the work of Shoshana Shababo, is that even though she does have a lot of references to Jewish texts, she's actually, because of different reasons that we can talk about it, she actually uses many more Christian theology thoughts, and also the same with Tzvi Litevsky. I think that her major sources are actually images of Jesus as the ultimate both victim and also the some kind of the entity of who will somebody who can change the world in a way. So I would say that actually a lot of women who wrote about sexual violence actually chose, I think in a very conscious way, to stay away a little bit from Jewish imagery, and they are using way more Christian images, way more.
That's really fascinating. I want to ask sort of a different question, and that's about teaching, right? You've been teaching a class this semester about sexual assault and culture and literature generally, right? Not just in Hebrew literature. And I wanted to ask you if this experience of teaching has brought sort of maybe new insights to some of the texts. You know, for the second edition, what would you add? And just wanted to ask you what it's been like to offer a class like that, which, you know, is over enrolled, right? You have way more students than the cap originally allowed for, and speaks, I think, to the interests of students in this sort of dialogue.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's actually an interesting question. I mean, I'm really happy about the course. It's also the first course that is a dual course, both in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Near Eastern and Judaic Studies. And it was very important for me that it will be a dual number to this course, even though from the registration perspective, it's a real nightmare. But I want to say something that I'm not teaching anything from the book, which is very interesting. And for years when I was working on this topic, I knew that I had to offer a course like this, but I just didn't dare. I didn't know how to address the topic. I didn't know how to deal with emotions that may come up while discussing this topic. And only after the book was out and when I knew that I would not be able to change anything is when I allowed myself to create a new syllabus that is actually, I would say it's probably a part 2 of this book, because it deals with, it takes intersectionality to different levels. I mean, the book really focuses on modern Hebrew literature in the Zionist context, etc. And the course really relates to much more to issues of race, for example, that are not part of the book so much. And it travels in the world in a much more intense way. We're talking about sexual violence in Brazil, in Cuba, in the United States. So it's a totally different approach to sexual violence.
So you started to speak on this a little bit, but I was wondering if the sort of works that you spoke about in your book, what resonances, right? What are the cultural resonances you see of these discussions in contemporary Israeli culture today?
You mean can you explain?
Yeah, so I just mean so you bring up all these, issues, the national body and the woman's body being conflated in acts of conquest, issues of discussion and survivor versus victim. How do you see these play out in Israeli culture and literature today, right? Do you see those motifs still playing themselves out in any particular Israeli way? Thinking of, I guess this isn't sexual violence, this is domestic violence, but the recent discussion of Shira Isakov, a woman who was almost killed by her husband, or you and I have spoken a little bit about Lenore Abigail, right? The former Miss Universe, who speaks out against as a rape awareness advocate.
Yeah, so I think that the question is, and I'm mentioning it also in the book, that my expectation was really to, when I started this project, I thought it would be a very easy project. I thought that I would just go to show some kind of progress, how in early stages, everything was so chauvinist and horrible. And now with women's writing and the blooming of women's writing, we see different approaches to sexual violence. It is, of course, not the case. But I think that the reason that I was so interested in the works of Shoshana Shababo, for example, or Rivka Alper, or even Fogel and Schofman, was because they did. It was like it's like the raw area of understanding or conceptualizing sexual violence. I think that writers today, no matter what they write, they have this language, this feminist, important and amazing language about trauma, about violence, about oppression, etc. And you can see it in the writings. But what the early stages of modern Hebrew literature had to do is not just to work on their modern Hebrew, that goes without saying, but also to conceptualize what they're experiencing in a different way. But I think that your question actually brings us to what Sue mentioned also, that you said that you hope that we're going to have discussion about how Israeli society in general and why Israeli society cannot really deal with sexual violence. And I think that that's probably, if I understand your question correctly, is the core of the argument. Like what do writers and activists do today in terms of sexual violence? I don't know if you want to say something about it.
I don't have a lot to say, you're the expert, but I'm thinking about that notion that literature sort of lags behind and how we might, why that is. But the larger question of how the culture deals with sexual violence, I think, is the whole project of your book, is to expose the failure to deal with it.
Yeah.
in literature today, they have also already the conceptualization and they have the language, but still there are poems and poets, especially like Lauren Milk and transgender women who raise a totally other perspective of sexual violence and violence at the home, and it's still that the Israeli society doesn't know how to treat sexual violence, especially the establishment, and you can see it every day in the Knesset, in every session. So it is still the language and the conceptualization is evolving, and still they have many challenges.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that maybe it is related more to, again, what Sue mentioned in the paper about the fact that when we're dealing with representations or of sexual violence, it forces society in a way to look itself in a mirror in a way, and that's something very challenging, of course, for every society. It's not anything unique to Israeli society, and that's probably one of the reasons that we have sometimes this gap between thorough representations of sexual violence, but then this indifference almost in society. Yes.
I just, on the larger question, I think I'm going to be bold here, but I think if you have a society, a nation that truly believes that its safety depends on violence, then what happens to the whole idea of, then all violence in some ways can get conflated as necessary. In a way. I mean, I just wonder if
That's, yeah, although I will say, I don't think that question is only for Israel. As a lot of you know, I worked for the US Naval Academy for a couple of years, and which is a whole nother discussion entirely, but that is a huge question that is asked, especially of returning vets, when they use violence, when they don't, when it becomes domestic, and all that. A lot of the conversations we're having today remind me of that. I want to end with the classic, I would say, annoying book launch question, which is to ask you about what's coming next. And I know you've started to work on your work with disability, but if you could just give us, let's say in the 2 to 3 minutes we have left, a little bit of a preview so we can start preparing for the next book launch.
What's coming next is first a very long siesta. But as Jonathan mentioned, I'm working on a project about disability culture in Israel. And the focus of this project is a dual focus. First, to read the art, literature, and films of people with disabilities in Israel, and the way that they're not trying to overcome their disabilities, but rather they're using, so to speak, their disability as a starting point for a larger exploration of different issues in Israeli society. But at the same time, also to show how ableism in Israel is really the starting point in many ways for those artists. So it will be an exploration of what people, artists with disabilities are doing, but also a very, I hope, a deep exploration of where they're coming from and what are they trying to challenge by focusing on their disabilities. So that's the project. Any different kinds of disabilities, needless to say. Neurological disabilities, physical disabilities, emotional disabilities.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Ilana, of course, for writing this stunning book, to ChaeRan and Sue for their comments, everyone else who attended, whether virtually or in person. And make sure to check out our social media for upcoming activities. We have a seminar tomorrow about the social history of the 1948 war with Shai Haskani. Should be excellent. And I hope everyone has a good day. Thank you all again so much for coming.
Thank you, ChaeRan.